Yeah, thanks, Cathaoirleach, and I'd like to welcome the Minister to the House and welcome the delay in bringing this bill into the Seanad. As the Minister would be aware, only 2% of the laws made in this country every year actually come before the Dáil and the Seanad. Most of the laws that come into effect in Ireland are EU directives, EU regulations or statutory instruments signed by ministers directly into the Irish law, and they never receive the scrutiny that they deserve. This is one of the few occasions where a directive has to come into the Houses of the Oireachtas to be scrutinised before being passed. But as we see, we have less than 4 weeks to do it, despite the fact that the directive started out in 2013, and this government, previous governments, have failed to put in place systems in this House and in Ireland whereby directives from Europe, many of them are excellent and much needed, are only dealt with in the last minute and don't receive the proper scrutiny that they do and should require. In 2009 there was 47 acts of the Oireachtas, and yet there was over 1,200 EU regulations, 547 EU directives, and we had nearly 600 statutory instruments. 47 acts of the Oireachtas. That's all the legislators were in charge of. The rest were done by the ministers and the civil servants. This bill is to be welcomed, and obviously in light of the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, where nearly 8,000 barrels a day, that's nearly 100,000 litres, disappeared in the first 24 hours, and increasing nearly to 6 million litres at the height of the disaster per day. Obviously it's very important that we would have something of this nature, and that with the estimated 10 billion barrels in reserves off the Irish coast, having a proper safety and regulatory system is important. That's nearly 1.1 trillion litres of oil and gas reserves. The Minister outlined the bill excellently, and there are a number of issues which I suppose, and when industry is welcoming a bill in relation to safety and regulation, that's got to be something we have to be concerned about, because it says that there's no cost to the Exchequer. What I'm concerned about, was there any regulatory impact assessment done in relation to this? Because we had a promise in the programme for government that the Department of Expenditure and Reform would do regulatory impact assessments in relation to bills like this. Obviously, we don't want to be putting undue burden on oil and gas industries or on the suppliers, but it's important that we know what regulatory impact assessment there would be on them. And I have a concern there in relation to the decommissioning of oil and gas platforms. You know, it is great for the taxpayer that we would get the revenue out of it, but what we don't have is a situation where if a company decides to fold its tent, close up its operations in Ireland, and there is no entity to chase for the decommissioning, for the withdrawal of the platform, that in fact all the money that we might have got and would have got from the taxation and from the levies applied on the industry would then be spent on actually decommissioning oil and gas platforms. And there are, and this is some concern, and I think the Minister would be concerned about this as well, there are some sections in the bill where it talks about a minimum, that a maximum amount of money that would be applied in terms of fines. And you know, the definition of as low as reasonably practical is very much open to interpretation. And I know they're talking about best practice, but I am sure that in other jurisdictions they would have a definition of what is as low as is reasonably practical in relation to the prevention of major accidents offshore. And I refer to section, I give it to the Minister so that they can, when we come back to this, because we don't have a huge amount of time, and I know this is a bit like committee stage, but we're going to ram through committee stage, and I don't blame the Minister for that, it's just the way the bill is coming in. Section 8, Safety Case Guidelines, and it talks about an appropriate technical principle and specifications relating to decommissioning of infrastructure. But like, should there not be a bond put in place by, as you give out a license, you also ask the company to put a bond in place and say, well, if your company goes to the wall, at least we'll be able to get the money off the bondholder to decommission the infrastructure, because the concern is that that would be a massive cost on the taxpayer into the future. And one of the other issues is I suppose the lack of actual, I suppose, punishment, is one way of putting it, I won't put it that way, in relation to not carrying out requirements by the new authority. And also a limit in terms of fines not exceeding 3 million is one of the fines. A conviction or indictment or a fine not exceeding 3 million. Now, why we would limit an oil company not exceeding 3 million, the Minister would be interested to hear that the clean-up from the Gulf of Mexico disaster is now at 14 billion. And it's still not finished. And BP every now and again issue an announcement saying the clean-up is done, finished. And then the US Coast Guard says, actually, no, it's not done, and there's still more clean-up being done. 14 billion, and we're putting fines, another fine at another section in section 15, reporting a petroleum incident. And that's why I highlighted the first 24 hours in relation to the Deepwater Horizon one, is that information and particulars as may be prescribed by the Commission without delay and no later than 24 hours after taking these measures. This in relation to reporting an incident. Now, that was one of the issues in relation to the Deepwater Horizon incident, is that it wasn't reported early. Now, the fact that it went on for years obviously was a huge issue, but that they don't have to actually report anything for 24 hours and make the state aware, that's in section 15, 2 at the bottom end of that. And then if they don't do it, there's a fine of $1 million. Now, you'd hope that they would do it, but, you know, these companies deal in trillions, and, you know, we're imposing, you know, an on-the-spot fine. It's an equivalent to a parking fine for some of them. And then there's the issues of transparency, what the Minister talked about, and the Commission may, with the consent of the Minister, publish a non-confidential version of the report, but then there is also confidential versions, which again would lead to a lack of transparency. My concern, Minister, in relation to it, obviously, given the limited amount of time that we have, is 4 years, you know, with 2 years to do it, and we're doing it in four weeks, which has happened before, and I've spoken in this House many times about the lack of process when it comes to what is essentially a good directive. I'm not giving out about the concept of the directive, but we are missing opportunities here. And I think one of the most important one is consequences for the operators not doing what they should do. And there is an issue here also in relation to we talk about the safety measures being in place and where there should be fire tenders and, you know, the equipment and all that. But, you know, have we actually got that in place? Like, you know, how many fire brigades would be required? And obviously, because it's offshore, mostly offshore, you're going to have boats that can deal with incidents at sea. Now, the fire services are provided by the local authorities. They don't have these boats hanging around the place. How many do we have? How many is required? How many are needed? Is very important. And then, if there is an incident and the equipment isn't there, whose fault is it? Because if you have to start bringing it in from the Gulf of Mexico or from the North Sea, you're talking about days. And they were the, I suppose, lessons that should have been learned from the Gulf of Mexico disaster, that the equipment wasn't deployed on time. So, Minister, I just wanted to make those points. I know it's the generality of the bill we're supposed to be discussing, but in reality, we don't have a lot of time to get this right. But one of the things I would ask you, and it might be a legacy issue, being as Donegal and Kerry could be badly affected by oil rigs just sitting there, which has happened in California and other places, because who's going to pay for them to disappear? And we should have a bond system in place whereby the government at least have the call on it in the event of the company no longer being in existence, and then at least there's money to pay for the decommissioning of those rigs. Thank you, Caoimhe.